News now, it's time to meet the author, and here's Nick Higham.
This year is the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, and here in Windsor, the tour buses and the castle are doing brisk business. The publishers, too, are getting in on the act. One book published to mark the Jubilee is Young Elizabeth, The Making of Our Queen, by the historian and biographer Kate Williams. We came here to the Hart and Garter Hotel, just across the road from Windsor Castle, to meet the author. Kate Williams, you start this book with an account of the day in December 1936 when Edward VIII abdicated. Now, what was the significance of that day for the Queen?
I think I'm fascinated by the significance of the abdication of the Queen. We often think of her, she is our second longest reigning monarch, there forever. But really, she was never expected to become Queen. No one ever thought of her as Queen. And it wasn't until her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated, George VI, her father, took over, Bertie, he became George, that catapulted Princess Elizabeth into a whole new world. She'd been petted, she'd been loved, she'd been admired by the public previous, but then she was heir to the throne. I mean, unless her father had a son, and that looked very unlikely. So she was thrown into this whole new world, which she completely had not been prepared for, and it was nothing that she'd ever expected or wanted.
The Queen sometimes comes across as rather cold and aloof, and yet her childhood, from your account, seems to have been an especially warm and loving one with her parents, her sister Margaret, very close family unit. Was it the abdication which changed all that?
Their father had had a very unhappy childhood at the hands of George V and was determined that his little girls should have a perfectly happy childhood, and they did.
So how did the abdication change that?
The abdication changed everything. Previously to being carefree, running around the gardens, then their father became king, and he had no more time for them in the same way. He was completely preoccupied by his new role, as he had to be. And also, he was terribly distressed by the abdication of his brother. He was strained, he was ill, he was nervous. He knew that the whole country thought he wasn't up to it. He was too weak and feeble and fragile to do it. And so he was very strained, very distressed. And the Queen also, later the Queen Mother, she was equally upset by it. And the whole family, the delighted, the happiness, the kind of the way in which they lived was completely broken apart forever.
The Queen certainly never seems to have forgiven her uncle Edward VIII for abdicating and putting her and before her father into a position that they never expected. She comes across as rather lacking in sympathy. And the same is true in something else which you write about quite extensively in the book, which was her sister Margaret's flirtation, love affair with a much older man, Group Captain Peter Townsend, who was married, and it was seen as a very unsuitable match. But the Queen, in both these cases, comes across as someone who doesn't really have a lot of empathy.
The entire royal family blamed the Duke of Windsor for leaving the throne because they felt it had hounded George VI into an early grave, who of course died very young of lung cancer. The idea was he was just exhausted and hounded and very tried by it, and had he not been king he would have lived longer. So he was very, very resented by the royal family. Queen Mary was always unhappy with him, and he wasn't invited to the Queen's wedding or indeed the Queen's coronation, and she stopped the allowance to him that her father had kept up. And also with Margaret, that's a very tragic story. Margaret fell in love with the equerry to the king, Peter Townsend, and hadn't really considered what that would do to her claim to the throne. He was a divorced man. She couldn't possibly marry him and keep her claim to the throne.
Margaret hadn't considered that, but then when it became clear that she was going to have to give him up, her sister, the Queen, seemed tremendously unsympathetic.
Well, it's very sad that when Margaret did actually give him up, finally renounced him, the Queen and Queen Mother weren't really there for her, and she spent the evening on her own, that actual evening that she'd given him up. And I think that both the Queen and the Queen Mother, the way in which they operate is that they say, OK, life must go on. We're not going to let this get to us. We're just going to continue as normal. We must keep continuing, which of course is the way that you must be to be a queen. You can't possibly be affected by falling over or being ill, because you have to keep going. And I think they expected Margaret to be the same, whereas she was much more emotional, much more tempestuous, and couldn't just kind of brush things under the carpet and get on with life. It really affected her.
She comes across, though, doesn't she, both as an adult and as a child, as a bit of a prig?
As a little girl, the Queen was rather a little bit of a prig. She was very perfect, very ideal little girl. She was always dutiful, always responsible, making sure her shoes were lined up properly next to her bed and folding up used wrapping paper so you didn't waste it. And she and Margaret, when Margaret came along, it made the Queen much more fun, because she and Margaret have to kind of have fights, because Margaret was so much more tempestuous and exciting and had all this imagination, and she was very naughty as well. But the Queen throughout her life has been rather brilliant at doing her duty, and I think sometimes it's quite hard for her to see how some people just aren't as good at it as her.
But wouldn't you really rather have written about Margaret than about the Queen?
No, I much prefer the Queen. I think she's an possibly engaging subject, and truly incredible at how she has managed to survive for so long, to succeed for so long, to be so impressive, and to make herself this queen who everyone thought was rather young when she came to the throne into this great monarch. I think she is the 20th century, what she's been through. Margaret is engaging, imaginative, glamorous, beautiful, but to me her life is tragically wasted. She had no idea what to do with herself.
Now, you've written a number of biographies, a number of history books. You started as an historian and biographer, but you've also recently published your first novel. So does that mean that you are switching course, that a novelist is what you're going to become, rather than an historian and biographer?
The way I see it is that the two go in tandem, and I feel very strongly that they complement each other, because in a history book you can't imagine, you can't speculate, you can't conjure new worlds, because that would ruin the history book. And we've all read history books in which there's imagination and speculation, and it ruins the story. And in a novel, you can't have too much fact-dumping, too much history. It just doesn't work. Too much footnoting. Again, that ruins the story. So I love the fact that I can do speculation and imagination in one and go wild in the novel, and then I can do, proper, scrupulous research in the other. And I think they complement each other.
Kate Williams, thank you very much indeed.